Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Dr. Eric Jackson. I want to thank you for coming out this afternoon to this great presentation. I'm the president of the African American Genealogy Association, at least today in this role. I have many hats, so in this role today, this is the role I'm playing today. First thing I want to do is to recognize all our co-sponsors. Number one is the Boone County Public Library. We have folks here from the library. We also want to recognize the Boone County Borderlands Archives and History Center. You have bags on your chairs that's part of that organization, that group. Also want to recognize the Kentucky Humanities as a co-sponsor of this event. And I also want to recognize Norris Media for all the technology pieces to this event. So today we have a great speaker, Frank X. Walker, but before I introduce him, I'm going to hand the mic over to my colleague, Denise.
Good afternoon. I'm Denise Payton, and I am a AAGGKY member. And thank you all for coming out. We're real excited about this program. Just a couple of housekeeping things. In December, our Zoom meeting will comprise a Zoom meetup of historical associations and genealogical associations. We tried this last year in 2023, and we just got together to network, to talk about what the different organizations have been doing throughout the year and to share tips about things that we could do to enhance our programs. So that will be in December. We're still working on January. We had a bit of a schedule snafu, so we'll be able to announce that on our website once we finalize that. So again, thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Denise. Now I have the pleasure and honor of introducing our fabulous speaker here, Frank X. Walker, come on, Frank, come on. Take it all in. Multidisciplinary artist and educator Frank X. Walker is the first African-American writer to be named Kentucky Poet Laureate. He is the author of numerous books, numerous children's books. A is for Appalachia, the 13th collection of poetries, including Turn Me Loose, The Ghosting of Medgar Evers, which was awarded an NAACP Image Award of Poetry and a Black Caucus American Library Association honor. So it is my pleasure and honor to introduce Frank X. Walker to present on the topic, how African American resistance and resiliency in Kentucky won the Civil War.
Yeah, it feels strange being at a table on a stage, so I'm going to walk down here to this podium and hope that if you're not in the seat where you can see the screen, I'm going to be using this PowerPoint for the first part of the talk, which I'm going to zoom through because the reason for the talk is to give you a sense of the information available to me as a poet, and I'll try to communicate how I harvest the same information that genealogists use to produce genealogy and information to share, but why it's different for me as a poet. And some of this that you'll see has to do with form, some has to do with just where the inspiration comes from. And then there's a great deal of this that's very personal when it comes to how it intersects with my own personal family. And then it takes on another level. You know, I'm going to try to talk about where the information came from, what kinds of information are out there and are available, and all the wonderful help that I had to get to this point, including Denise on the stage, who is primarily responsible for a 90-page document of some of my family's history that nobody in my family had even known it existed. And it just popped up in the email one day. And nobody in my house could believe it, you know, so we'll save that. The screen in front of you has a title of a new book called Load in 9 Times. And if you're unfamiliar with that term, We'll talk about it a little later in this presentation. But hopefully out there in Zoom land that you're getting just the screen and not my shiny bald head. This whole story starts from this idea that I remember in middle school hearing that Kentucky was a great place to be enslaved. And for a kid, 15, 14 years old, I didn't really think about what that meant. And it took years to understand, how the mythology about Kentucky's role in the Civil War, role with the, peculiar institution, and what appeared in our history books and what was being shared in our communities and in classrooms really shaped how people of color and race relations in general work in today's society. All that, including, a kind of tension that was probably more prevalent before the election. There was all this tension in the air that was based on division and trying to ply people against each other. And you could really feel that everywhere you went. Imagine how it felt researching the Civil War and recognizing that everything I was reading about the 1800s sounded like now. And it didn't take long to find and trace some of the connections and the threads straight back to this idea that, some people are still fighting the Civil War in Kentucky and in the South and in this region. And one of the ideas is that, or potential wrong defenses of this being a different kind of place because of Kentucky's neutrality, supposed neutrality, is that there were no plantations in Kentucky. This is a poem that has a list of all the plantations in Kentucky. And I just want you to see it. I'm not going to read it, but I want you to see it because of the fact that it exists as a particular kind of form in this collection called a ABC Dairy, and somebody's computer is talking. Some of the information available, it comes out of archival information. And this is an example of old newspaper pages. And this particular page is from the 1800s. And you can see, if you look real close, of the bottom left-hand side, there's an ad for a self-liberated individual, a runaway named Cheney. Up at the top on the right side, there are other ads, and these ads appeared in newspaper pages right next to the sale of goods. It's this idea that not only were people of color treated like property, even in newspapers, they were listed in the same way you would list regular commodities and products. I share this because UK Libraries is collaborating on a project called Freedom on the Move. They're trying to digitize every single slave ad that appeared since the colonial times all the way up to 1865, and they've already started. And I think they have almost 800, thanks to student volunteers and paid workers at the library, that just came from Kentucky newspapers. And that's just a tip of the iceberg. So imagine when they're all up and being able to sit at your computer and just push a button and get the information that you've been waiting for however long you've been waiting. Here's a close-up of the Cheney ad and 3 ads on the right from Kentucky. The one on the right that says $4 at the top is from my own hometown, Danville, Kentucky. The one beside that is Jessamine County. And the one at the bottom I use because it references a child in New Orleans who belonged to somebody back in Kentucky. It's this idea that, there was almost no slavery happening here. It's such a myth. There's all kinds of newspaper accounts that prove that that's not the case. When it comes to the Civil War, the ad on the right is an ad that was written by Frederick Douglass. And it's probably one of the most famous recruitment ads. Even if you go to the Smithsonian in D.C., there's a large version of this behind glass as part of the exhibit. What most people have never seen, including myself, is the Kentucky version of the same thing, which I was elated to get a copy of because it says Danville on it, Lexington-Danville Turnpike, the old road between Lexington and my hometown. And part of my immersion in this subject and the book and the project is because I work in Lexington, grew up in Danville, and have probably passed Camp Nelson a million times in my 63 years, but never really appreciated how important it was to my own family and our history and Kentucky history until the last year and a half when I started researching this information in earnest.
Frank, could I pause you for a second?
Sure.
I think we have a conflicting Zoom right now.
Okay.
So you're looking really good just for us. For everybody else, they're on a different Zoom. So I'm trying to combine those so that people online can see you.
Sure. Can they hear me or they're just not seeing?
They're not seeing anything at the moment. So give me
For the sake of Zoom.
2 minutes.
So you guys heard the story about
You want to tell a story?
well, this story is much better. I remember when we first started Zooming. Anybody in here experience Zoom bombing? Oh my God. I at least twice at the beginning of Zooming, in the middle of a presentation, suddenly some other voice and images took over the screen. And it was more than frightening. It was X-rated even. And I thought, well, this is not going to last very long. But apparently they figured out how to get around it. I think that's what webinars are supposed to do. But Zoom is supposed to not have enough firewalls to protect people from interrupting or getting it wrong. And my biggest fear at every presentation is that the technology will go wrong. So I'm glad to get that out of the way. Now we can get on with it. But it helps to be in such a friendly audience. Looking at all my former NKU colleagues. NKU, raise your hand. Look at us, half the room. Former student, that counts. Okay, there you go. Former NKU adult league basketball players out there in the room. We had we call it the AARP league. And if you would witness what would happen on those courts, but only judge it by the enthusiasm of the participants, it would feel like an Olympic event. But if you were watching with the judgment of somebody who only appreciates sports at the highest level, you were going to be disappointed. But we had fun. We enjoyed each other. We rarely got hurt. Well, that's not true. Some of us just stretching might pull something. Forget, trying to dribble full court or a hard rebound, a body check, things that we used to do. But I think we played the game on two levels. There was a game that we played in person, and then what happened in our heads. And when we got back home, we told the story to our loved ones about what happened. We only told one version, I always bragged about the dunks and the finger rolls and the half-court shots, none of which ever happened. But somehow I remembered that, it just stuck in my head. I'm a creative writer and thinker. And that was my creative memory at work as well. Are we good? If you just came in on Zoom and heard the end of that story, I apologize. I will not explain it because I'm just rambling. I hope I haven't been pushing all this time. Okay, so part of this wonderful research that's been made available, if you don't know Reckoning Inc., get to know it. The most amazing database in the world, especially if you're in Kentucky and you're interested in ancestry research via Civil War soldiers, which is how I got pulled into this project. I was hired by Reckoning to just write some basic bios after harvesting some information culled from the files that Denise had access to and her team. And that was happening. And at some point, I realized that some of this information was kind of exciting to me, that I was kind of imagine the stories behind the lives of, and I asked permission to write a poem or add a poem to the bios. And I remember Dan said simply, why, yes, of course. So then every bio I wrote, I added a poem to it. And I think many of those poems still appear on Reckoning's website. And you can see those. And at some point, I remember that, we might have had some Civil War history in our family, and I asked Denise if there was anything connected to a couple of names I sent her, and she sent back this 90-page file of information, and it just blew me away. And it was connected to Randall Edlin, whose registration card is on the right. And then as the research continued, turns out I had 2 third great-great-grandfathers, both at Camp Nelson during the Civil War, on both sides of my family. And then as we kept researching, I think we have 4 now who fought, who were part of both sides of the family. And all those years I've been driving by just thinking that place had nothing to do with me. So it's really interesting to be connected to it now. This is an image that's really one of the more famous images. People study the Civil War around the country, but most people don't know that these soldiers, even though they're in Arlington, Virginia, guarding a fort, they're from Louisville, Kentucky. So these Kentucky soldiers are everywhere, and their numbers are what most people don't realize is that if you consider the African-American men who left the state to join the Union Army, Kentucky was in second place behind Louisiana for the largest number of African-American soldiers contributed to the Union Army. But if you add the people who left the state, there's nobody even close second. I mean, we're way over the top. And what made it more significant is that Kentucky came in not at the beginning of being eligible to join up, towards the end, and most of those soldiers had a 3-year commitment. So even after the war was over, people in Kentucky were still signing up, and still signing up mostly because slavery was still legal in Kentucky. So a lot of families had to have people sign up to get that freedom because there were still masters who liked the fact that the war was over and they still had slaves. So that was a good deal for them, except for this war effort, this army, this evil army presence that was happening. So those numbers are significant. This is a picture of Charles Singer from northern Kentucky. I think he was a barber somewhere near Covington. This is a thing about Camp Nelson most people don't realize. It wasn't just a Civil War camp. It was also a refugee site. And because of the refugees there was a refugee school and the equivalent of a hospital and a church and the kind of freedom that really, when you look at Kentucky African-American history, the first real freedom in Kentucky for people of color collectively happened at Camp Nelson because of what was happening at Camp Nelson, because of the chance to go to school and work in a hospital and be employed, even though some of that privilege came out of some negative circumstances. Here's another images. If you look at these children, but notice they don't have on children's clothing. I mean, they're all dressed the same way adults will be dressed. You see all the suspenders and the hats. This is a close-up shot, and I use this shot because on the left you can see a blurry image of a child, and I mention that now because it's something that informed a couple of poems that will show up in the book. Here's the larger, let me go back. On the far left, your far left, is that image, close up. And here's an image of all-girls classroom outdoors at Camp Nelson. You don't see war in this picture. You see this image of the refugee camp. This is a visual of housing and people in the road or the space between a row of houses in this refugee camp. Imagine 10,000 plus soldiers all signed up at almost the same time in one summer. And many of them bringing their families when they left, when they self-emancipated. It wasn't safe to leave them back on the farm. not plantation. So they brought him with them. And you can see what was happening. Here's some more documents from that 90-page file that include affidavits, widow's pension, invalid claim, to give details about Randall Edelin's effort to collect his pension. And then when he passed away, his wife's almost 10-year odyssey to try to claim that $14 a month. But it took almost 10 years. She had to prove that they were married with affidavits. She had to prove that he was dead. She had to prove they had children. She had to prove that he was a soldier, that he had been stationed at Fort Bliss, that he'd actually been injured. And it took 10 years worth of documents, which, thanks to whoever was collecting documents, back then, they put them in the right slot. That information exists today and has really informed a whole body of work. So just seeing these documents, these are some of the dates, 1888, 1867. I mean, these are over almost 160 years old. This is a close-up of the document on the end. On the left, the original invalid claim that talks about how he was injured. He was ordered to remove from a corral which was situated on the banks of the Rio Grande River a box of government blacksmith's tools on account of a flood in the river which caused the bank to give away, and the corral fell into the river. In lifting at the box of blacksmith's tools, his back was strained, causing him pain and suffering. And that has been disabled fully, one half from manual labor. But more interesting to me, at the bottom in red, claimant does not write. So a whole issue around literacy became part of the conversation in this collection of poems. If you look at this close up to one of the affidavits, this is Mary Edelin, the wife, the widow of Randall. And when I first saw these affidavits, I just kept flipping through. And then at one point I realized that her name looked different every time. Then I looked even closer and I saw that between her first and last name, there was something happening. If you can see, it says her mark. And there's a mark that looks like an X or a sideways cross or whatever you think it looks like. And it wasn't that light bulb went on that I realized that she was illiterate. And I went back through all the documents just to try to fully understand what was happening with the literacy issue and recognize that every time a person who was not literate signed their mark, it had to be witnessed by two people who were literate. And one of the documents, as you move through the 10-year odyssey, had the two witnesses, William Edelin and Scott Edelin, who are her sons, which really warmed me up to recognize that this literacy commitment is happening in the family. And if you look at the quality of both of their writing, you can tell that one was a better student than the other. Or one was significantly younger or had more experience. But as a writer and as somebody who reads cursive, there's something about fine penmanship. I think about my grandmother, who was a school teacher, and how committed she was to, your hand and how you hold your hand and sit upright and how the letter should appear on the page. So that by itself was inspirational for me as a poet. There are other details that I talk about in the book because the book is in three different categories. One deals with before the war, one during the war, and one after the war. And the thing about the after the war information that I want to share comes out of this idea that people are very familiar with runaway slave ads, but there's a whole set of ads that appeared in newspapers in Reconstruction where black families were looking for their lost family members. And these ads that just say information wanted, if you read some of them, information wanted of my daughter, Martha James, when last heard was from in Montgomery. You scroll down, of my son, Daniel, 15 or 16 years old of age, formerly belonged to Clinton Williams. Of our 5 children, whom we have not seen for 4 years. Imagine after enslavement and your number one commitment is to find your family, and you don't know, you can't just call them. You can place an ad, you can ask people, you can walk. You can't, you don't have the means to just travel somewhere and try to find them because you don't know which way to go. So that became one of the challenges and one of the stories that I wanted to focus on, because the Civil War is too big. So how do I make it smaller? One of the things that was happening in the same space as trying to find families is that black people were organizing themselves politically, and this is from a meeting in Tennessee, but it was happening in Kentucky as well. In Kentucky, in Frankfort specifically, the colored citizens of Frankfort of Kentucky, in protest against the domestic terrorism happening to black people all over central Kentucky, they wrote a letter to Congress, and that document was entered into Congress, and it lists all these heinous crimes and lynchings against black people and white people who supported newly freed black people in Kentucky. And so this particular form, just called Our Grievance, comes in the latest section of the book. But I just want you to see how the poems are being built. These two documents are archival sources, are recreated there on the stand. But there's this idea about even the song. A lot of people who love the song, My Old Kentucky Home, who sing the song, who cry when the song is being played or sung, feel very differently than I do when I hear the song, because I know the song's history, and I know it's tied to minstrelsy, and a lot of people don't even know what minstrelsy is, or don't believe that the song was connected to minstrelsy. But here is a copy of Christie's Minstrels, My Old Kentucky Home, the sheet music, as sung by Christie's Minstrels. And if you know the history of minstrelsy, you can just trace that through line back and grab that evidence for yourself to talk about why that's a poor choice for a state song. And the year that song was written, this poster appeared in a newspaper in Kentucky. So it tells you about what was happening in Kentucky in this time period and what that song is really about. And that'll make more sense when I get to the poems. I try to recreate those two ideas on the same page as a poet. And you see that the original lyrics are there, and the original ad text is also there, but now compressed into the same space as a kind of mashup form. This idea of what is the most precious commodity and property in Kentucky, Kentucky being about horses or people, is in the form of this poem called a contrapuntal, where you look at it and you see two columns, but what you're looking at is three different poems. There's one poem on the left about one subject, there's one poem on the right about another subject, but you can read them as one poem straight across and ignore the column, and it becomes more difficult to tell what subject you're talking about. So I may read that one later as well. But it's accompanied with this ad that appeared as part of the archival information that I thought was interesting, because the top ad is about a horse that was stolen. And if you read all the way through the ad, you find out that there was a man attached to the horse. But the horse was more important, obviously. But to me, it kind of reiterated this idea about, what's more valuable in Kentucky during this time period, horses or black people. This is a poem called How Salt Works, and it deals with an event that's being commemorated next Saturday at Camp Nelson. And it's the 160th anniversary of the Great Expulsion. And at the Great Expulsion, there was a new general who came into Camp Nelson, and he ordered all the families kicked out of Camp Nelson. Over 400 people were kicked out, and 102 of them died from exposure to elements. Some of them had been ill, and it created such an uproar. People were writing letters to the New York Times, and eventually the Department of War reversed that decision and forced them to not only let the families back into camp, but to provide housing and food and clothing. And that's how the refugee camp became a refugee camp, because of that awful thing that happened. But there was also a thing that happened in Saltville, one of the massacres connected to the Civil War. You may have heard of Fort Pillow, which was heinous. But there was a Saltville massacre where soldiers from Camp Nelson went down to Saltville, Virginia, but were ambushed. And they had the worst possible position. They were undertrained. And not only were they forced to retreat immediately, the retreat happened so quickly that a lot of the wounded were left on the ground. And the next morning, the Confederate officers or soldiers showed up, and they executed all the black soldiers that were there. Some of them were in hospital beds and were murdered in their beds. And so two of the horrors that are commemorated at Camp Nelson, there's a monument to lives lost from both of those situations. So this poem tries to talk about both under the title, How Salt Works. If you think about salt works as in Saltville, Virginia, but also salt and tears, and also how salt can burn a wound. So there are all these emotions happening for the poet, trying to interpret what this poem means and how it moves down the page. And there's no one way to read this. It's really up to the reader to figure out what the topics are and how and where they cross, and if they're the same thing or not. But I really want to share this just so you can see the form. I mentioned Mary Edlin's signature, and I imagine at some point that she started to recognize her own name, even if she was illiterate. There's a poem about that. This is a poem called The Golden Shovel, and in the book you won't see it in two colors, but here I've colorized the right column so you can see how a golden shovel works. In the golden shovel, you get a reward poem. There's a homage to another poem inside the poem, and many of you may recognize this line. We wear the mask that grins and lies. It hides our cheeks and shades our eyes. That's a fairly famous Dunbar poem, but when you hear that read inside the other poem, you won't hear that at all. You have to know that it exists because it's a golden shovel, and then go look for it. So that's a double thing happening. Some of the stuff that I do on the page is for historians. Some of the things I do are for people who love poetry, and I need that kind of affirmation that it's poetry happening. This is another example that you won't see in color in the book. It's all in black and white. But this is a polyphonic poem, and it's in three voices. You see three columns because these things are happening almost simultaneously. And when I read it, I will only read two of the columns. But I share this with you so you know that the left column is the sergeant giving the orders to communicate to the soldiers how to load and fire a Civil War musket. The third column is this internal monologue that the soldier is having while he's thinking about his motivation. And the thing in the middle are just the physical things your body does in response to the orders. If you have a chance to get to D.C., go see Ed Hamilton's Spirit of Freedom. It's at 10th and U Streets. What was that? The beauty of this is that he's a Kentucky sculptor. He's based in Louisville. But this monument, some people make the mistake of not walking behind it. You see the soldiers on the left and sailors on the right, but if you go around to the backside, their families, just like at Camp Nelson, came with them, and they're on the concave part of this monument, which really makes it special. And beyond that, there are a set of metal plates that list the names of all the participants, all those Union soldiers, including Randall Edlin. And that's my dirty fingernail pointing to my third great-grandfather after I found him on the wall. And it was, a special moment for me. And I imagine for a lot of people who go there looking to do this very thing. So as you complete your own research and make this connection for other people, you got to make that homage, make that pilgrimage, and document that moment, because it's just scrolling through the names and then finding it that just is such a powerful moment, at least personally. this is just kind of an ad for what's happening at Camp Nelson. They're going to be celebrating the Civil War as part of the 160th anniversary through 2026. And I think I've done 3 programs already this year. I'm doing another one on Saturday and another one in February. But there are programs every weekend and tours throughout the week. They're partnering with Reckoning Inc. They're going to install a database there that will allow visitors to actually do research on site connected to Civil War soldiers. And I think they're getting the entire database. And I hope they're paying for it because they got federal money. But, I apologize that felt rushed, but I'm a poet, and I really didn't want to come and give a lecture. I wanted to read poetry. So the lecture is over. And now some poetry. I'm going to read some poems that are from this book. That's the cover. That deal with Kentucky in a real way that a lot of people don't connect. And since we're in Margaret Garner country, some of you know that name, some of you realize that it should be a louder voice. I'm going to read a poem that is in the voice of Margaret Garner. And those of you who don't know the story of Margaret Garner, that means you may not know Toni Morrison or Beloved, the movie or the book, and understand that there's an individual, there's a character in that who's based on a real person. A woman who is most known for killing her 2-year-old, cutting her throat, rather than have her go back and live the life of a slave. The problem with that story is if you do more research, you find out that Margaret Garner didn't get to testify at her own trial. And even in that trial, her life story does not come out. And I wanted to write a poem that gave her, her humanity back and explain some of the trauma that may have influenced some decisions she made. So I'm going to open up with a poem called Testify, which she didn't get to do. In the voice of Margaret Garner. Look at me and my swollen belly. Look at my pale, pale skin. Look at this scar across my face. Don't call me murderer. My slave name is next. Look at my children. You think they look like Master Gaines too? Step back from all this. Stop eyeballing me and the sharp, sharp blade. Take a closer look at the white men. The older Gaines, who was also my daddy, sold me to his brother, which means my uncle has kept me barefoot and with child since I was barely 15. I got 3 more at my waist, 1 on my hip, and 1 more in my belly right now. But don't count the children. Look at the scars on my face. These ain't from my husband's hand. I spared my baby girl not from this life, but from my life. You saw how much she looked like me. Half the lawyers think this whole trial be not about murder, but if we be people or property. But it take another woman like Miss Lucy to understand that it really be about something else, something much worse than taking a life or knowledge in one. About making a woman's body your smokehouse and root cellar. About believing her sour, sour plum is your fresh fruit. That's all I got to say. That's from Margaret Garner. Take a breath, take a breath. Some of these this is war and enslavement, so these are not happy poems. So prepare yourself. I tried to insert some humor here a couple times. Check the time here. Okay. Why I Don't Stand. I apologize in advance because I can't sing. Oh, the sun shines bright on my old Kentucky home. $1,200 to $1,250 for Negroes. 'Tis summer, the darkies are gay. The undersigned wishing to purchase a large lot of Negroes. Well, corn tops ripe for the New Orleans market, and the meadows in the bloom. I will pay $1,200 to $1,250 for number one young men and $850 to $1,000 for number one young women, while the birds make music all the day. In fact, I will pay more for likely Negroes. Weep no more, my lady. Oh, weep no more today. Did any other trader in Kentucky? We sing one song. My office is adjoining the Broadway Hotel for my old Kentucky home. On Broadway, Lexington, Kentucky, for my old Kentucky home, far away, where I or my agent can always be found. You feel that? Right? So that tension that I talked about, when I think about that song, I needed it to come through the poem. And I hope people can read it and find a way to interpret the thing on the page as close to the way I read it as possible. But that's how it's meant to be heard. And I think as a poet, the advantage we have over historians is that we get to take emotional energy and bring it to the page, because what we're trying to do is create something that's cinematic so that you leave feeling like you experienced that moment, right? Which means that you remember it longer and better, because if you don't remember the words, you remember how it made you feel, right? That's the goal. That's why the emotional part makes these stronger poems. And sometimes, that emotion is in a different direction. So see if you can feel a different emotion in this poem. It's called Grove, and it comes from that first image on the first slide where you see the soldiers. You can't see them in this. They're in front of the barracks at Camp Nelson, and they're standing at attention in these itchy uniforms and tight shoes. And I'm imagining, as a poet, what must it have been like to know that your signature freed your entire family. In Randall Eland's case, 8 children and a wife. 1 X, boom, 9 lives. The power of that X. And now you're in a uniform. Sun is hot, but a month ago, you were chopping tobacco. You were getting beat with a lash. You were being treated like you were less than human. How must that feel to look up and down this line and know that it's different now? So this is called Grove. From the photo of troops standing at attention outside the colored soldiers' barracks, Camp Nelson, Kentucky. In the voice of one of those soldiers. This was the first time we really look at each other and not be able to tell who master the cruelest, whose sorrow the deepest, who ground been the hardest to hold. We was lined up like oaks in the yard, all standing with chins up, chest out, shoulders back, and already nervous stomachs in. We was a grove wanting to be a forest, ready to see what kind of wood we made from. The only thing taller or straighter than us be the boards holding up the barracks at our backs. Though most our feet feel pigeon-toed and powerful sore from marching back and forth every day for what seemed like more miles we walked to get here. It take more than pride to stand still neath these little hats not made for shade. Soldiering ain't easy, but it sure beats the bloody leaves off of bondage. So you feel something else, but it's different. Let me read another one. And I was hoping to find something that would allow these soldiers to feel and communicate something in a direction that's even more than pride, something towards arrogance even, right? I found a picture of Jesse Hobson, who's there in the middle. You see him over there. And Jesse ran away from, he's self-emancipated near in Western Kentucky, escaped to Paducah, was put on a steamboat up to Louisville, eventually ended up in Camp Nelson. But on the back of his photo, it said he was chased to the swamps for a week by his master. And, and I thought, well, that's horrible, but That's like an Olympic event. All right, Jesse. Okay. This is called Catch Me If You Can. From the photo of Jesse Hobson. They say that's me standing at attention in the picture, imitating a sycamore, feet booted, rooted to the ground, looking like my hat and uniform, my same fingernails and hands. They say the face looked like me, but I can't be sure. I was never so lucky as to own a mirror. This is the first and onlyest picture of me I ever seen. My feet are not moving, so you can't tell how fast I really am. I could have been a racehorse. Our whole company was mostly runners. Master Hobson chased me through the swamps for a week. Owned a whole county in West Kentucky, tucked between two rivers, but he couldn't catch me. Not even with hounds. Water ain't nothing but a muddy track for a born runner. The voice behind the box said, stand there and hold still. So I let the pop and flash of the camera try to catch me. But he couldn't know how hard that was for a man like me to stand there like a log, as if old master looking my way, looking for something in the woods out of place, something moving, something he think he owned, but it's just a sound of hooves. See, that feels too, right? I mean, you feel that too. So here's another one. My wife, after the first draft was done, she said, where are the women at? He said, it's about families. I see all the soldier poems. So I was not finished. Here's the poem in the voice of Mary Edlin, Randall's widow. It's called Affidavits. I told you some of the backstory before about how long it took her to try to collect that pension. But also, I'm trying to communicate a sense of pride she felt at some point that's tied to literacy and a recognition of what letters are doing. And something else that's connected to her husband that hopefully you'll catch in the very end. They'll make me scratch out an X in ink with 2 witnesses on affidavits to prove me and Randall was married. I fetched affidavits from every doctor still living that examined my husband's piles and old man's bladder, witnessed his pain, and still doubted his suffering while he rot from the inside. Them even bade me to make my mark after David with more witnesses to prove my Randall was dead and gone. They made me X the page with witnesses so many times on so many pension papers that though I cannot read or write a lick, I come to recognize my own name when I see it. They fancy M on Mary come to look like a woman keep changing her mind. And the E them like to put on Edlin, a tired old biddy in a bonnet who done set herself down and quit. I first think my mark looked like a tired old cross. But after a while, I come to see a long, sharp knife like my Randall's old scabbard from the war. So that's one of the women, love. But one of the more important women at Camp Nelson was a woman named Ebel Mitchell. And she was, you heard of Berea College. You know that John Fee established Berea College, but before he created Berea, he created the education school system at Camp Nelson, and he hired Ebel Mitchell, who was from Danville. So I'm going to share some poems that are connected to her being a free woman and eventually being chased away from there because they mistreated her. She wasn't allowed to stay. But I imagine her, having those classrooms full of black children reading for the first time and what that felt like as a teacher. So here's 2 poems together. First part is called Every Page a Mile in the voice of Ebel Mitchell, Camp Nelson Refugee School. I was born free. What I learned in books helped me to remain so, taught me to insist that others cross that river Jordan too. Thanks to the Bible, many of my people tied literacy to their salvation. Their real freedom was waiting for them in a heaven filled with bookshelves. It was my honor to teach the families of brave colored soldiers at the refugee school, to witness them on their journey to learn, to be reminded of how reading and discussing books was like a new pair of traveling shoes. Children's song. What a joy it was to unshackle their imaginations, to see something different start to glow in their eyes. Miss Mitchell, why called his story if it's about us too? Miss Mitchell, we hear the white teachers won't eat with you. It's because you black or because you was already free. Miss Mitchell, I've been up all night counting all the new places and things you put in my head. Miss Mitchell, listen to me cast a spell. M-I, crooked letter, I, crooked letter, I, humpback, I, Mississippi. This song is a church bell ringing. So you feel that teacherly pride. Let me skip a little bit. You guys doing all right? Okay, just one check. All right, good. Yeah, doing my job. One of the things that happened at Camp Nelson, because they wanted the soldiers to be literate, so they were allowed to take classes every night. And those who couldn't wait to be fully literate, to write letters home to their wives, they had an organization at the camp that had these volunteers, all Methodist women, who would transcribe letters home for the soldiers. And the other people who could read would read them back to the soldiers when they wrote them back. So here's a poem called Mail Call, M-A-L-E, in a play on M-A-I-L. And the stationery they used to send the letters home, at the top it said, "Let it hasten to those who wait for tidings." And this is in the voice of Private Edward Francis, who's a whole set of his letters from Richmond. His wife was in Richmond. Between him and her from Richmond to Camp Nelson were published. Mail Call. I was a fool to believe the money in the letter I sent back home to my wife wouldn't up and run off and get lost. I always pray the words straight after the white lady scribbled across the page and my voice then signed E. Francis. If I close my eyes when my mail returned and is read out loud for me, I can almost see and hear her, lining her words up like she herself sitting there warming me like this fire. I imagine the dancing tongue of the flames is her voice, and the sparks that shoot up is her little laugh. Then I open my eyes and stare at the blazing hot ember and pretend she giving me that look till the glow softens and burns out. It's them moments more than anything that make me want to learn to scribble. That and not trusting these Christian letter writers with the words every man want to whisper to his wife when he miss her this much. Somebody asked me if there are any love poems in here. I think that's one. One of the challenges of this is trying to find a way or to answer the question of how does humor work in these multiple stories? If you understand that humor is how a lot of black people survived hardship, that it's not because it was funny. I mean, if you listen to Richard Pryor, all of his stuff comes from a whole lot of pain. And it's what he does with that pain to process it into something else that makes people laugh. And sometimes that laughter comes from people being uncomfortable with the subject. But the way it's delivered tries to be the thing that separates the pain from that kind of moment of levity. So there's a whole series of poems in here called, there are two soldiers. And this first one is called Two Soldiers Can't Sleep, Tell Jokes. And this first one will give you kind of a hint of how they work. I'll tell you in advance, they're not funny, but they try to gesture towards humor. Two soldiers who can't sleep tell jokes. White captains say to colored recruit, "Tell me a joke, boy." The recruits say, "What's a joke, sir?" Captain said, you know, a little story about life that makes somebody laugh. The recruit said, I've been a slave all my life. I ain't had nothing to laugh about. Captain gets mad and says, that can't be true. I hear you niggas singing and laughing all night long in the barracks. What's so damn funny out there? The recruit scratches his head and thinks for a minute and finally says, well, sir, it probably sounds like laughing to you, but we is mostly just crying. Captain said, crying? What the hell y'all got to cry about today? Yesterday, y'all was all slaves. The recruit said, oh, we ain't forgot about yesterday, sir. And we ain't too torped about today, but we full of tears about tomorrow. Captain say, what the hell's happening tomorrow? Recruit say, that's just it, sir. We don't know neither. And after a while, they both laugh a little. See what that's trying to do? And just gets close. The others are even more challenging. I'm just going to read one more poem for you. And it's the poem I gestured to that has 3 columns. I'm just going to read the first and last column. And this was inspired by the movie Glory. There's a scene in the movie Glory where the sergeant is in the ear of a recruit with a revolver, and he's shooting this revolver off while he's trying to load his gun, and he just collapses. He just can't pull it off. It's too much pressure. And the problem with that for me was that one of the biggest reasons behind denying African Americans from joining the Union Army in the first place were this idea that we didn't have the mustard for it. We didn't have the mettle to be soldiers and to perform under pressure during battle, in spite of 300 years before that. But I thought, well, if he was properly motivated. So, Load in 9 times, the title poem. Load, I wonder. Handle cartridge, if I look down. Tear cartridge, the business end. Charge cartridge of my musket. Ram cartridge, and see old massa. Return rammer, standing there. Prime, if I will hesitate. Shoulder arms, or remember. Ready, how many times? Aim, he beat my wife. Fire. Thank you. I think that's 2 o'clock on the nose, but can we do Q&A? Okay.
Okay. We're going to start the Q&A session. We're probably going to have a lot of questions, so please ask questions and not make statements.
Yeah, and also understand that
Just
some of
ask
the questions can be addressed to the experts up here on
do that.
on the panel.
And I'll pass them on to you. So, if you have a question, just raise your hand. Do you guys have mics? Thank you.
Anybody? Speechless. I did it again. I broke them. That's good. In the middle.
So you mentioned that you did some of the poems specifically for Reckoning, Inc., and that you attached to those soldiers. Are any of those included in this collection?
Yes, they're in there. About 4 or 5 of them, I think, are in the collection. And if you go to the website, you can actually see them. Front row.
How did you realize, and at what age did you realize that this was you, giving us all this wonderful information in this wonderful mode, and poetry being the avenue to which you were doing that?
I don't know that I did, but I can tell you how it started and how I got lost along the way. I'm one of 11. I have 7 sisters. None of them like me. Growing up, we didn't have a television by choice. It was a religious choice in my mother's household. She was a Pentecostal minister for 22 years, so we weren't allowed to have a TV. So I had to choose between those 7 sisters who didn't like me and books. So books and I became best friends. So I would hide under the bed with a flashlight in closets, away from them, in a book, and became fairly literate very early. And that really made school easier for me because I could read ahead of my peers. And, I didn't understand why everybody didn't want to sit on the front row. And because school was happening and this teacher thing was happening, and it was all exciting to me. We had the Childcraft library, a real encyclopedia, not a thing on digital space. I read every single page. That was my world. We didn't have the money to travel around the world or even on vacation, but we had books. And so that was the world to me. So I became acquainted with stories very early on. My mother also was in charge of the children's everything at church, which meant she also wrote and directed the children's plays, which meant that there's a certain level of performance expected in the house. And recitation was expected in the house. And whatever she needed, she might come in and say, somebody didn't show up today, you an angel. You're going to play Joseph. And it wasn't a debate. It wasn't even a question. She might measure you with her eyes for the costume, and an hour later you might be on stage performing your role. That's just how it was at our house. So I think the whole idea of creativity and stories and talking in a space and kind of understanding the importance of words to stories and something approximating truth-telling that came out of her religious experience and conviction kind of set the stage for me later becoming a poet. But I'm a failed fiction writer. I'm trained as a fiction writer, and I'm just slow. I don't have a novel. I think I have 1 short story published in 40 years. But I got 13 books of poetry, if anybody's counting. But when I grow up, I want to be a filmmaker. So I think about, as a fan of cinema, a fan of great stories, a love of history, that all that stuff just kind of intersects for me. Chris Yohe is writing an interesting book that comes out hopefully next year that deals with all that and what it's trying to do on the page. She might want to answer some of those questions that might come. But that's the best response I can imagine.
How old were you when your first poem became real and somebody saw he's a poet?
Wow. I was in high school. We were in high school, because I say that because people thought I had a twin. I was a jock in high school, football, basketball, track. And when I participated in sports, I didn't wear glasses, right? And when I was in the hallway reading books, I had not just glasses, but the thick Coke bottle glasses, which meant I couldn't have been an athlete. So much so that people would tell me on Mondays, I know you must be proud of your brother. Boy, he was amazing Friday night. And all I could say was, yeah, he was all right. Yeah. And it hurt me to my core that people didn't believe that you could be intellectually, excellent and an athlete at the same time. They just couldn't see those in the same being, so much so that it's like believing that aliens invented pyramids because Africans couldn't have done it. It's that same kind of mindset that just made me go, what? I was that kind of kid. But in high school, I wrote a poem about the vice principal. And it equated him to the guardian of the gates of hell. And it got published in the school journal. And people walked up to me and said, Frank, love that poem, And it's the first time I felt something, like, wait a minute, it wasn't for a touchdown, I wrote a thing, I created a thing, it had words in it, and somebody just like hugged me for it with words. And I loved how that felt. And I didn't feel it enough, back then. I didn't write it. I think maybe 3 poems in high school, but that was the first time.
We have one question here in the back, and then we have people online.
Yeah, actually, one of the questions online was, is the book going to be available in audio form, preferably with you doing the voice?
Oh, good question. Tell them to write W.W. Norton and make a request, because it's their call.
And this is just, I'm just getting your opinion on something,
Sure.
Because I think what you're providing is preserving, the history. And when I saw that Kentucky was the second highest when you talk about slave owners, and when you got to the poem of My Old Kentucky Home, I'm a big horse race fan. I go to the Derby all the time. And so I'm asking your opinion on this, because we've been taking away and dismantling all these other Confederate, statues and figures and all this. What is your opinion as far as, stripping away My Old Kentucky Home that is being nationally sung every year the first Saturday in May?
Amen.
Oh, that's the easy button. Yeah, I don't think we should sing it ever. I think the song should go with the Confederate monuments. I think it is a Confederate monument, but it's a song. It should go to the same place. That we need a new song. Stephen Foster wrote other state songs, and at least one other state decided to throw that song away because they also agreed that it was racist, and they replaced it with a new song. We got a long way to go before we can get the ability to do that in Kentucky, because this is a different kind of place, and we know what I mean when I say that. Because it would take legislative maneuvering to make such a thing happen. But at the same time, a really progressive athletic department at, say, some university that's a flagship could decree from the top that we're not going to sing that song at basketball and football games anymore, and it wouldn't happen. Or some All-American could say, I'm not playing tonight if you sing that song. But, if I said it out loud, that might be heresy. I mean, my job might be on the line, so I didn't say that. You didn't hear me say it. Even online, it's recorded. Yes, song got to go. Uh-oh, no trouble now.
No. Thank you for this wonderful experience today. I just want to ask how you feel this book does or does not compare to your other works of historical poetry. There are persona poems in all of them, but different type of focus, like narrower in the other books of historical poetry, more on one person. This is more voices. I like that there are more women, like When Winter Come happened from Buffalo Dance. But I'm just curious does it feel like it's part of that same group? Does it feel like you're doing something different? And then, of course, what are you doing next?
I think it is the benefit of the other books. I think it's better than the previous books of historical poetry, only because I've already written those and I learn something every time. And what made them better is the women's voices, the other inanimate objects that speak, like the palisade, rock fence in this collection, not unlike York's hunting shirt and Buffalo Dance, but or the bullet in Medgar Evers' Unghosting. But I always hesitate when people ask me, what's your best work? I always say I haven't written it yet, so I can be motivated to just get up in the morning and write. But I really like this book. I like this book because of what it does for poetry and how much poetry it invites to the page, and what it does for Kentucky history and history about a subject that I think has been undertold. Like, if I had known what I know now about Kentucky's role in the Civil War and black families' role at Camp Nelson, I'd have felt differently growing up in Kentucky, And I think that I'd had a higher self-esteem. I'd been prouder to be from here. And I think if everybody knew that story, they would have treated me differently. So I really am hopeful that multiple people come to this book from everywhere in the world and get whatever they need from it. You know, I think poetry can do that. And I hope that every time I read those poems, that somebody feels something for the first time, even if it made them uncomfortable. But they leave recognizing the power of poetry and think that, well, maybe I'll buy another book of poetry, you know, because I didn't know poetry could do that. Or listen to you read, I saw the whole thing like the movie. I didn't know poetry could do that, you know. I'm always trying to convert people in the poetry fans, because if you recognize that the New York Times bestsellers list never includes poets and poetry, you know, people would rather buy a biography, you know, or a cookbook. But poetry can save your life, you know. I think if you're really reading poetry close to the bone and in a conscious, you know, way, and you're thinking and feeling your way through those pages, that it could change you. That my mother, and I like her anecdotes, but, you know, she thought she was raising a minister, another minister in the family. And she came to my very first poetry reading, and she saw how people responded to the poems, and she said, "That'll do." And I think what she was commenting on was that there's a kind of poetry in the world, and I think it's what I try to write, that kind of forces you to feel something, right? You don't just hear it and think, oh, thank you for that useful fact. That it's like, oh, you know, I had a moment, or a eureka moment, or a new idea that it planted a seed, or that you're a fan of poetry. And I had a guy come to the Kentucky Book Fair, and he said, I gotta tell you, Mr. Walker, I don't like poetry, but I keep buying your damn book and giving them away. And I didn't know how to feel about it. I was like, I think that's a compliment. But he didn't even understand what was happening, but it changed him, you know. But he didn't understand it yet. But he understood there was something good and useful was happening in these pages, but not just for him. So for people he cared about, he was like, you know, I think you need this. And he would give them away, and he'd come back, and could you sign 6 more? And he'd come back the next year. I need 4 more this time. I got like a cousin and my ex-wife. She need to be, you know. I'm like, you know, what you doing to people with this poetry? But I think that's as a fan of poetry and a teacher, you know, I really think what I really love about book clubs is not the books themselves, but what happens when people all read the same thing and then have a discussion. Because it allows you to bring your personal life and history into this same space, into a safe space, and you all have common, you know, nomenclature and stories to compare it to, and something useful happens, you know, something good happens almost always. I think everybody should be forced to be in a book club, you know, especially in Kentucky. You know, we need book clubs everywhere. Every library should force those, you know. You can have a library card, but you have to be in a book club, you know. Raise your hand if you're in a book club. See, look. We got 2 people who figured it out. But think about it. Imagine the thing you're talking about is not from the news. It's not politics. It's not the election. It's this thing that, you know, may have been in another century, but you found a connection to your own life, you know. And it's also easy to talk about those kinds of things anyway, because you can project them into other people's lives and time periods. That's so useful. I don't know. That's the best answer I have. There's some more hands. 3 on the aisle. It's like church. Pass the plate.
Thank you. This is just kind of piggybacking off of what you said. As an avid reader, like as a child, that's what I do. I don't watch TV or anything. And I've been moving into reading more historical pieces. And so I'm, you know, just discovering kind of your work. And I was wondering if there are any plans to maybe do like a collection of all your books, maybe like buy all in one. maybe like a special edition, but I think that would be a great way to introduce people and, as a great gift. I can see myself gifting it, so I didn't know if you had plans for that.
All right. Well, thank you for that. Norton is in talks with University Press of Kentucky to acquire the first 2 York books because they have a 3rd York book I've written, and they want to publish all 3 of them together in the same volume. The 3rd York book was also, I always hate to say this because it's not out yet, but the 3rd York book was purchased by a filmmaker in California, and it's going to become a feature film. Don't clap yet because it's been in pre-production for 3 years now. And I'm still waiting on, but it's in pre-production. But I think that, I thought about what part of history is missing if I did a whole book of history, African American history, in persona poems or collection. Starting with the York books, jumping to Isaac Murphy, Civil War, this recent book, jumping ahead to Medgar Evers. There's some gaps in there. I'm probably 3 books away from that being a legitimate ask of a press, but I'd read it too. And I'm not the only one doing this. In spite of the absence of categories in bookstores and libraries that say this is a historical poetry section, there are a lot of people writing these kinds of works out there, and you just have to try to find them after you found mine first. But
okay, I'm that Frank X Walker. What is your middle name?
X.
Well, your X looks like the lady's signature, and I was just wondering if when you write that, you do that on purpose to make it look like her signature.
No, actually, I was already X before I discovered that she was X before me. It was a beautiful moment when I realized that it just felt like, at least emotionally and spiritually, that this ancestor was reaching across time for me with her X, like high-fiving me, like, welcome. We've been waiting for you, pal. I was born Frank Wesley Walker. I changed my name legally when I was an undergraduate. After earning the nickname X from my peers, after a brief stint as an actor on stage, imagine Malcolm X themed glasses and hair, tinted red, and this kind of attitude, like X. And I was also a full-time visual artist and a writer, and I couldn't figure out how to be both at the same time. So I started signing all of my visual art, Frank X Walker, and then the writer was Frank Wesley Walker. And then I got a check for a reading, and it was made out to Frank X Walker, and they wouldn't let me cash it at the bank. No, that's not true. It's partially true. So I hired a lawyer and had my name legally changed so I could cash a check and continue in this direction as a committed artist, understanding that the X stood for not knowing your original African name in that same tradition as Malcolm X. It's not a political statement, it's a cultural statement. And my commitment to the name and the culture is what I'm grounded in. I worked in cultural centers before I became an arts administrator. I used to teach around the country in Atlanta and Birmingham and Lexington, Afrocentric children's day camps, understanding, that trying to get children to be more proud of who they were and what they looked like really impacted their development. And it impacted me. And so I think that adults are not, the good ones are not accidents, nor are the bad ones. That if you trace anybody back to their childhood, you can find these threads that impact who they become and the decisions they make eventually back to something that happened in their childhood. So I believe in giving children, the most impactful and useful and positive experiences as kids, because it's just a seed. And when that grows into something, you don't have to be here to watch it. You just know that if it's a good seed, if it's an apple seed, you don't have to know that it's going to grow something else. It's an apple seed. Eventually they're going to get apples. So you put that good in there, put that positive, put that cooperative, put that, communal that helpful, if you raise those kinds of kids. Like my mother always told me that I can't take credit for anything, any award I ever get. It's not even mine. It's like, she said, we made you. You're not an accident. You're not self-made. You were who we were trying to make. So, think about that. Next time you feel good about something you accomplished, you just playing catch up, or you were good in spite of your parents' efforts, But she would say, I was trying to make a minister, but I'm glad she settled, right? She settled. But this is kind of ministry, I mean, look at this setup, right? Audience, a podium, lectern, the good book. Amen.
I'm curious about what happened to Camp Nelson over time. Was it forgotten and became a historic site? What is it like now?
Oh, yeah. Everybody must visit, for one. If you can, come next Saturday at 3:30 when we have the Luminaria. We're going to honor those 400 people expelled and the 102 people who died at sunset. And it's a 1 mile hike at the same time, so bring good shoes. Camp Nelson, once they pulled the troops out, there were over 100 buildings at Camp Nelson, and they tore them all down, all of them. There was a small black community across the street near the John G. Fee Church that became, first it was called Ariel, then it was called Hall, but it was a black community where former soldiers and their families try to live, but understand that I mentioned there was a reign of domestic terrorism in Kentucky that lasted almost, well, it's not like it's over, but for 10 years there was a concerted effort by former Confederate soldiers, Kentuckians, 25,000 of them joined the Confederacy. Many of them came back to Kentucky afterwards. They chased black people out of horse racing, especially the riders, and they rode around Kentucky, sometimes 200 people strong, on horseback, committing violence against black families, especially former soldiers, burning them off their farms, killing, raping, maiming. It was horrible, but it's not in our history books, but it happened and it's documented. I'm not even sure where the question came from, but Camp Nelson was one of the safe spaces, but it became so difficult at Camp Nelson because all the soldiers were like, well, they're trying to be brave, they're trying to be uppity, let's try again, and they just kept raiding Camp Nelson until those black communities gave up. The reason Nicodemus exists, 250 folks from Kentucky say, you know what, we out, right? And they left and went and formed a whole new town in a whole other state. And that wasn't the first time Kentuckians left Kentucky of color, Liberia. We had a lot to do with that. But it was rough here after the amount of pushback, and this book doesn't skirt around it. The amount of pushback that happened every time there's black progress in the United States, there's backlash. I think, we're in a current period in our country because Obama was president. That's just my opinion. It's part of the backlash. But I'll stop there. Go to Camp Nelson. In fact, it's a national park now. It's officially a national park, and it's only happened in the last couple of years. You must visit Camp Nelson. It's a must. If people in charge of schools and field trips, they need those buses, the kids to start coming back through again, because after COVID, they stopped. Field trips stopped because everything was in a box and online, but they're trying to get that back. They need those bodies, and the education needs to continue happening. And unless there's a question online,
there is one more question.
We'll take that one. That'll be it. That's all I got.
They're curious about the title. If you could expand on and discuss the load in 9 times.
Oh. Okay, maybe that somebody tuned in late. Load in 9 times is the official set of instructions for how to load and fire a Civil War musket. That poem that says, load! I mean, each one of those steps allowed, if you look at those reenactments or the films about Civil War, it's one big puff of smoke, and then another big puff of smoke, and then another puff of smoke. It's because they're all firing at the same time. And they're able to fire at the same time because they're following the order of somebody, telling them when to load, when to aim, when to fire. And then the next line stands up, does the same thing, and then the next, so it just poof, 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 poof. At first, Norton said, we don't like the title. And they said, would you consider naming your book My Old Kentucky Home? Really? Yes. No, this was somebody in New York, and this was they were sitting around a table, and they said, we have this our collective thought is that it should be My Old Kentucky Home. And I said, there's a line in Color Purple that Sophia sings, hell no. That's not gonna work. And then they pass it up the food chain, and an editor at Norton recognized the term immediately and was a Civil War buff and said, we're gonna keep that. So whoever he was, he saved me and Norton because we was about to break up. I'm like, of all the titles, like you're gonna reverse my whole thing. But you guys thank you for being a warm audience. Thank you, Denise, for everything. And you, Sarah, the man with 10 hats.
We got two more announcements, kind of clean up items.
Okay. Before you leave, we just want to invite you, if you're not already a member of AAGGKY, to please join us. We have our treasurer here. Catch her before she leaves. Membership is $30, and that's a 12-month membership. So please join us.
I joined today.
All right, and then I just wanted to thank you all for coming again and for joining us here at the Boone County Public Library. And thank you, Frank, for that phenomenal presentation and sharing your poetry and all of your experiences, thoughts, and joy with us here today. He has been gracious enough to sign some copies that we have available for participants who are able to come and join us in person today. So we have 3 copies of Load in 9 Times. If you can check under your chair, you can feel right in the middle near the edge, there should be a sticker. And if it's not under your chair and you have an empty chair next to you and you want to check that chair too, go right ahead. Check more chairs down the line. It's a bright orange sticker right near the edge in the front of your chair. It would feel like a kind of like a smooth. Yeah, we got one there. check more chairs in the row if you're alone. We've got 2. All right, there's one more. There's number 3. All right. So you can come on down and collect your signed copy. But Mr. Walker is also in the back with, he has graciously brought books available for sale and is signing today as well. So thank you all so much for coming.